Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Islamic Audiobooks collection. I will be reading When the Moon Split by Safiur R Mubarakpuri, which we downloaded from kalamullah.com. Let's read.
Page 160. Expedition of Sawiq. Meanwhile, Abu Sufyan was still smarting over the defeat at Badr. He thirsted for another military encounter, one which he felt sure would go their way, and swore that he would not bathe until he had fought with Muhammad, peace be upon him, again. With an army of 200 men, he came to Medina, seeking to acquit himself of his oath. Intent on spreading destruction, they raided a settlement named Arid, hacked and burned a number of precious date trees, and got away after killing 2 of the Ansar. When the Prophet, peace be upon him, received news of the raiders, he and his followers went out in pursuit. Abu Sufyan and his men succeeded in eluding the Prophet, peace be upon him, who pursued them until Karkarat al-Qadr. In trying to get away swiftly, the Quraysh were forced to get rid of most of their valuable provisions, especially the cornmeal or sawiq, from which the expedition got its name. The next thorn in the Muslim side was Ka'b bin Ashraf, an extremely wealthy Jewish poet whose enmity for the Muslims and their Prophet, peace be upon him, was unrelenting. Ka'b would use his considerable poetic talent to compose and recite derogatory verses against the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his companions, and the honour of Muslim women, while he eulogized their sworn enemies and incited them to fight the Muslims. Immediately after the Battle of Badr, he travelled to Mecca to stir up passions. To an already bloodthirsty and enraged Quraysh, he orated at length, bidding them to extract vengeance for their defeat. Ka'b was a skilled demagogue, and given the high esteem poetry and poets had in Arab society, his words worked a spell on the Quraysh. His call for revenge was welcome, as was his assurance that the Quraysh were on a higher spiritual plane than the Muslims. He exhorted them to learn a lesson from what had happened with the Banu Qaynuqa. The Quraysh were a willing audience, and they swore to act on Ka'b's advice. Having wound up his propaganda campaign against the Muslims, Ka'b returned to Medina to continue his subversive acts against the Muslim state. When the Prophet, peace be upon him, heard about Ka'b's return to Medina, he said to his companions, "Ka'b bin Ashraf has offended Allah and his messenger. Who will rid me of him?" In response to the Prophet, peace be upon him's call, Muhammad bin Muslimah, Ubad bin Bishr, Abu Nayla, Harith bin Aus, and Abu Abs bin Jabr volunteered their services. Muhammad bin Muslimah was appointed the head of the mission and accordingly thought up a plan. But since it involved subterfuge, he sought the Prophet, peace be upon him's consent before putting his plan into action. Having received the Prophet, peace be upon him's permission to entrap Ka'b, Muhammad bin Muslimah went to Ka'b. After Ka'b's initial wariness had worn off, Muhammad confided, "This man," indicating the Prophet, peace be upon him, "came to us asking for charity, but he has put us to great trouble." Muhammad bin Muslimah's words had the desired effect. Ka'b exclaimed with joy, "By God, you people will tire of him even more in the future." Now that Muhammad had gained Ka'b's confidence, he requested a loan of wheat or dates, leaving his weapon as collateral. His request was granted. Next came Abu Nayla with a similar complaint. He confided that some of his companions held the same unfavourable opinion of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and that he would bring them to Ka'b, as they were also in need of Ka'b's help. Ka'b graciously agreed to meet them at a later date, delighted at having found more and more disenchanted Muslims through which he could hurt the Prophet, peace be upon him. It was the 14th of Rabiul Awwal 3AH, and the full moon was shining down on Ka'b as he lay with his new wife in his fortress. When the 5 armed Muslims called out to him, Ka'b readily went down to see them, disregarding his wife's pleas to take care. He was so complacent about his success in finding collaborators that even the sight of the Muslims' weapons did not startle him. He certainly did not see himself as their target. They set out on a stroll. Abu Naila complimented Ka'b about his perfume and asked permission to smell his head. Flattered, Ka'b obliged. Abu Naila sniffed Ka'b's head and then, holding Ka'b's head in his hands, bade his companions smell the fragrance as well. He asked to do so again and was allowed to smell the fragrance once more. When Ka'b's head was firmly in his grasp, Abu Naila urged his comrades, "Seize this enemy of Allah." Instantly, the others struck with their swords, but with no success. Finally, Muhammad bin Muslimah used his axe to strike Ka'b's abdomen. As the axe cleaved his body, Ka'b died screaming horribly. The sound of the disturbance roused Ka'b's men, who lit torches around the top of the fort, but they did not find the 5 men who got away, having silenced their most vocal enemy at last. Ka'b's death greatly demoralized the Jews. In their newfound sense of discretion, they decided against open warfare upon the Muslims and went underground, and the Muslims were safe for a while from harassment. In Jamad al-Awwal 3AH, the Quraysh sent a trade caravan to Syria by way of Iraq. They entrusted the caravan to Safwan bin Umayyah and were not overly concerned at the risks involved, since the route went through Najd, far from Medina and the menace of the Muslims. When the Prophet, peace be upon him, came to know about the Qurayshi caravan with its precious cargo, he dispatched a cavalry of 200 men under the command of Zayd bin Haritha, may Allah be pleased with him. At Najd, as the caravan halted at a spring named Qarda, Zayd and his men swooped down on the caravan and its travellers. Even though the men managed to flee, their possessions fell into the hands of the Muslims, as did the caravan guide, Furat bin Khayyan. The humane treatment Furat experienced at the hands of his captors so impressed him that he became Muslim. When the booty from the caravan was evaluated, its worth stood at 100,000 dirhams. With this raid, the Muslims had inflicted on the Quraysh an economic defeat as devastating as the military one at Badr. Now the Quraysh had 2 humiliating episodes to live down. Badr and Qarda were bitter losses, and it was time to channel all their anger and hatred into a military strike against the Muslims. Preparations began at a furious pace as the Quraysh launched a recruitment drive and admitted voluntary soldiers and anyone with a personal grudge against the Muslims, especially those who had lost fathers, sons or brothers at Badr. Bards were brought in to incite the people with their songs of vengeance. Subsidiary tribes who owed allegiance to the Quraysh were also made to join the army. Women went with them to boost their morale and prevent them from taking flight. The Quraysh ultimately mustered an army of 3,000 soldiers with 300 camels, 200 horses and 700 coats of mail. Abu Sufyan was the commander-in-chief of the Meccan army, and the valiant fighters of Banu Abdul Dar were appointed its standard-bearers. The proud and fearsome Meccan army advanced towards Medina. On Friday, the 6th of Shawwal 3AH, they reached the outskirts of the city and camped in an open field in the valley of Qana below Mount Ainain and Uhud. The Prophet, peace be upon him, had been expecting the enemy for a week. He had already set up a patrol system around Medina to ensure the city's safety and had declared a state of emergency. When the Meccan army arrived, the Prophet, peace be upon him, sought the counsel of his companions regarding further defensive measures. His plan was to remain in the city with the men facing the enemy at the entrances of lanes and alleys, and the women attacking from the rooftops of their houses. When the plan was outlined before the community, the hypocrites among them, those who had become Muslim as a matter of convenience, were happy not to be out on the battlefield. Their leader, Abdullah bin Ubay, supported the plan since he could then sit safely at home without being accused of falling back from the battle. Some of the young men, however, were eager to meet the enemy in open combat and pressed for a direct military encounter. The Prophet, peace be upon him, agreed to their demands, and accordingly he divided his army into 3 squads. One squad consisted of the Muhajirin, the migrants, with Musab bin Umair as the standard-bearer. Another comprised the Aus tribe, with Usaid bin Hudair as the standard-bearer. And the third unit consisted of the Khazraj, with Khubab bin Mundir as the standard-bearer. After Asr prayer, the Prophet, peace be upon him, set out towards Mount Uhud and inspected his troops at Shaykhain. He decided to send back the youths among them in his desire to keep them safe. However, he later allowed Rafi bin Khadij to stay on, for he was a good archer whose skills would prove useful. Up came Samura bin Jundab, pleading to be retained also. After all, wasn't he stronger than Rafi, and hadn't he thrown Rafi in several wrestling bouts? Samura begged for a trial bout and made good his claim, so the Prophet, peace be upon him, allowed him to go into battle as well. At Shaykhain, the Prophet, peace be upon him, offered his Maghrib, sunset and Isha prayers. He spent the night there and appointed 50 watchmen to guard the troops. In the stillness of night, he then departed, going on to Shout, where he prayed Fajr at dawn. Just as things seemed to be going reasonably smoothly, the hypocrites struck the first blow. Abdullah bin Ubay chose to rebel against the Prophet, peace be upon him, at this point and withdrew with his 300 companions. His action sent Banu Salma and Banu Harith reeling. Surprised and dismayed, they reacted to the news so badly that they themselves considered retreating. Ultimately, the Prophet, peace be upon him's counsel and Allah's grace renewed their resolve, but the Muslim army of 1,000 had shrunk by almost a third to 700. Heading this truncated army, the Prophet, peace be upon him, marched towards Uhud through a short route, leaving the enemy forces in the western part of the area. He descended into the valley of Mount Uhud, all the while keeping his back to the mountain. Thus, the enemy stood between the Muslims and Medina. Then the Prophet, peace be upon him, drew up his troops for battle. On Mount Ainain, which later came to be known as Mount Ramah, he formed a unit of 50 archers under Abdullah bin Jubair al-Ansari and instructed them to hold back the enemy and guard the backs of the Muslim troops. He stressed that under no circumstances were they to withdraw. They were to await his instructions regardless of which way the battle went. The pagans also drew up their troops towards the battlefield, marching to the songs and cheers of their women who whipped up their zeal. Moving through the rows and rattling their tambourines, they sang, "If you go ahead, we shall embrace you and spread carpets. If you retreat, we shall take offence and be estranged." They addressed the standard-bearers, reminding them of their duty. "Look, Banu Abdul Dar, O defenders of your generation, strike violently with swords." When both armies drew near, the standard-bearer of the pagans, the most valiant man of the Quraysh, Talha bin Abi Talha Abdari, came forward on his camel and issued a challenge. He was answered by Zubair bin Awam, may Allah be pleased with him. Zubair jumped onto Talha's camel, threw him down to the ground and slew him. "Allahu Akbar," cried the Prophet, peace be upon him, and all his men echoed the cry. After the first ritual encounter, the two armies set upon each other. Khalid bin Walid, who was then head of the pagan cavalry, attempted 3 times to reach the rear. Each time he was pushed back by the shower of arrows launched by the Muslim rearguards. The Muslim soldiers concentrated their attack on the 11 standard-bearers of the pagans until they were all wiped out. As the enemy's standard sank to the ground, the Muslim soldiers hurled themselves towards the enemy. They charged into the ranks of the enemy forces and slew them in large numbers. 2 Muslims, Abu Dujana and Hamza, fought with great prowess, and their heroic feats on the battlefield were to become legendary in Muslim military history. Tragically, Hamza bin Abdul Muttalib, may Allah be pleased with him, the Lion of Allah, was martyred in the same battle he had dominated. He was killed by the javelin of Wahshi bin Harb, an Abyssinian slave who, with that successful throw, earned his freedom from his master, Jubair bin Mut'im. Hamza had killed Jubair's uncle, Tu'aymah bin Aday, in the Battle of Badr, and the grieving Jubair promised Veshi his freedom in return for Hamza's head. With his freedom in sight, Veshi sat behind a rock awaiting his chance to strike. As Hamza stood deftly beheading Sabah bin Arfad, Veshi launched his javelin. It pierced Hamza's abdomen and came out from beneath his legs. The Lion of Allah had fallen.
Jazakallah khair for listening.